At the corner of Fifth Avenue and Central Park South, where the city's most expensive land meets its most idealized dreams, the Plaza Hotel rose not merely as a building, but as a declaration. When it opened in October of 1907, the structure did not attempt subtlety. Designed in the French Renaissance style by Henry Janeway Hardenberg, the same architect behind the original Waldorf Astoria, the plaza announced itself with white marble walls, ornate ironwork, and a roofline that evoked European palaces rather than American hotels. This was deliberate. At the turn of the 20th century, New York's elite were still negotiating their own legitimacy, and architecture became one of the few languages through which permanence could be convincingly spoken. The plaza was built to suggest that American wealth, still young and often questioned, could rival the aristocratic gravitas of Paris, Vienna, or London. Yet beneath this elegance lay a tension that would define the hotel's entire financial life. The plaza was conceived at a moment when old money and new capital were colliding, when inherited wealth was being outpaced by industrial fortunes, and when the cost of appearing timeless was becoming dangerously expensive. From the beginning, the hotel was a gamble. Its construction cost exceeded $12 million in 1907, an extraordinary sum for a single hospitality property, even in Manhattan. Adjusted for inflation, it was one of the most expensive hotels ever built at the time. The logic behind this expenditure rested on a belief widely shared among America's upper class. That certain symbols were immune to economic cycles, that prestige could insulate itself from risk, and that owning a palace at the center of New York society was not simply an asset, but a guarantee. The first owner to embody this belief was Harry S. Black, a hotel magnate whose ambition matched the building's scale. Black believed the plaza would dominate New York's social geography, serving not only as lodging but as a permanent stage for elite life. He envisioned a hotel where European royalty, American tycoons, and cultural leaders would converge under chandeliers and carved ceilings, reinforcing the idea that wealth, once properly displayed, could perpetuate itself indefinitely. But the plaza opened into a world already showing signs of instability. The Panic of 1907 erupted the same year the hotel welcomed its first guests, sending shockwaves through the banking system and reminding even the wealthiest investors that scale did not equal safety. Although the plaza survived that early financial turbulence, it did so by entrenching itself deeper into the psychology of American wealth. Over the following decades, it became a preferred residence for industrialists, financiers, and foreign dignitaries. The Palm Court hosted power lunches where deals were implied rather than spoken. The Edwardian Room saw weddings that functioned as strategic alliances as much as celebrations. The hotel's image hardened into something close to myth. The plaza was not merely successful, it was untouchable. And that perception would later prove dangerously persuasive. By the mid-20th century, New York itself was changing. The city's center of gravity began to shift, subtly at first, then more decisively. Post-war prosperity expanded the middle class, suburbanization drew wealth outward, and the meaning of luxury evolved. Hotels were no longer just monuments, they were businesses increasingly subject to spreadsheets, debt structures, and shareholder expectations. The plaza, however, remained anchored in an older logic. Its maintenance costs were enormous, its staff requirements vast, and its ornate interiors expensive to preserve. Still, successive owners continued to treat it less like an operating company and more like a crown jewel, something whose symbolic value justified almost any financial strain. This belief intensified in the late 20th century as real estate itself transformed into a speculative instrument. Manhattan property values soared, not always because of income generation, but because of perceived scarcity and global demand. The plaza's location, sitting directly across from Central Park, turned it into one of the most coveted pieces of real estate on Earth. Ownership of the hotel became a statement of arrival into the highest tier of global wealth. It was no longer just American billionaires who coveted it, but international financiers, sovereign funds, and highly leveraged investors who believed that certain assets existed beyond the reach of failure. It was within this environment that the plaza would begin its most perilous chapter. The hotel became the centerpiece of increasingly aggressive financial strategies, each built on the assumption that its prestige would continue to appreciate regardless of debt, economic cycles, or operational reality. The building's marble halls and gilded ceilings masked a growing fragility. Loans piled atop loans. Ownership structures grew complex. The plaza was no longer simply owned, it was engineered. The gamble was not just financial, but psychological. Each new billionaire owner believed that previous failures had been a matter of timing or management, not of fundamental miscalculation. They believed they could succeed where others had stumbled, that the plaza would finally align prestige with profit. Yet each acquisition pushed the hotel further into a cycle where its symbolic value was monetized faster than its underlying business could sustain. The building that had once represented permanence was becoming increasingly transactional, its image leveraged again and again against the future. As the 20th century drew to a close, the plaza stood outwardly unchanged, its facade still pristine, its name still whispered with reverence. But inside its financial structure, pressure was mounting. What had begun as a palace built to legitimize American wealth was now a mirror reflecting its most dangerous assumptions. The belief that some assets were too iconic to fail, too important to collapse, and too prestigious to obey the ordinary rules of finance was about to be tested, not once, but repeatedly, and each test would claim fortunes measured not in millions, but in billions. By the late 1970s, the Plaza Hotel had entered a phase that would define its modern reputation. Not as a hotel struggling to remain relevant, but as an object repeatedly overestimated by men who believed scale itself could defeat arithmetic. New York City was emerging from a fiscal crisis that had nearly bankrupted the municipality, and real estate, once shunned, was suddenly being rediscovered by investors who sensed that decline had reached its bottom. Manhattan property values began rising not only because the city was recovering, but because ownership of iconic buildings offered something increasingly rare in global finance, a physical symbol of power that could not be replicated. The plaza, sitting at the city's most ceremonial intersection, became one of the most coveted of these symbols. In 1974, Western International Hotels acquired the plaza for what was then considered a bold price, but the true turning point came in 1988, when Donald Trump purchased the hotel for approximately $407 million, a figure that stunned even seasoned New York real estate observers. The price was not merely high, it was unprecedented for a single hotel property. Trump did not acquire the plaza primarily as a hospitality business. He acquired it as a statement. Ownership of the plaza functioned as a form of social currency, signaling that its holder belonged among the city's permanent elite, not merely its transactional developers. The acquisition was heavily leveraged, financed largely through debt, and structured around the belief that the plaza's prestige would continuously justify refinancing, appreciation, and expansion. The logic was simple and dangerously seductive. If the plaza was irreplaceable, then its value could only rise. If its value could only rise, then debt was not a burden but a tool. Trump publicly described the hotel as the Mona Lisa, an object whose worth transcended conventional valuation. Yet unlike a painting, the plaza required constant expenditure. Its aging infrastructure demanded ongoing maintenance. Labor costs remained high. Luxury expectations increased while profit margins narrowed. The hotel's grandeur generated admiration, but not necessarily revenue proportional to its debt. Within 2 years of the acquisition, the illusion began to fracture. Interest payments mounted as the broader real estate market cooled. Cash flow lagged behind projections. Trump, whose broader portfolio was similarly leveraged, found himself facing a cascade of obligations that prestige could not defer. In 1992, the plaza entered bankruptcy protection, marking one of the most visible collapses of the late 20th century real estate boom. Trump retained partial ownership after restructuring, but control was diluted, and the narrative of invincibility that had surrounded the plaza was permanently altered. Yet the hotel did not lose its allure. If anything, its survival reinforced a new myth, that even failure at the plaza was survivable, that losses could be absorbed, renegotiated, or transferred without lasting consequence. This belief set the stage for the next generation of owners, many of whom were less concerned with operating the hotel than with unlocking its perceived latent value. The plaza became less a place of lodging and more a financial instrument, a vessel through which capital could circulate, pause, and re-emerge transformed. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, ownership passed through a series of hands, including a partnership involving Saudi Prince Al Walid bin Talal, whose acquisition of Trump's stake symbolized a broader shift. The plaza was no longer primarily an American trophy. It had become a global one. International capital flowed into Manhattan real estate with unprecedented force, driven by political instability abroad and a belief that New York property represented a safe harbor. The plaza, with its name recognition and irreplaceable location, sat at the top of this hierarchy. The most consequential gamble came in 2005, when Israeli developer Elad Properties purchased the plaza for approximately $675 million. The price reflected not the hotel's operating income, but an ambitious redevelopment plan. Elad intended to convert much of the building into ultra-luxury condominiums while retaining a smaller hotel footprint. The strategy relied on selling private residences at record-breaking prices, marketed to billionaires and global elites who viewed ownership of a plaza address as a form of immortality. Apartments were advertised not merely as homes, but as artifacts, extensions of the building's myth. The timing, however, could not have been worse. Construction delays mounted. Costs escalated. Then, in 2008, the global financial crisis erupted, freezing credit markets and collapsing luxury real estate demand. Buyers vanished. Units that had been priced in the tens of millions lingered unsold. The debt structure underpinning the redevelopment strained under the weight of falling valuations and rising interest obligations. Once again, the plaza found itself at the center of a financial storm created not by neglect, but by overconfidence. By 2012, Elad Properties defaulted on its loans, and the plaza passed into the hands of creditors, including a consortium led by Sahara India Periwar, whose founder Subrata Roy would later face his own dramatic legal downfall. Each transition transferred losses rather than eliminating them. Billions of dollars in paper value evaporated across decades, absorbed by banks, investors, and individuals who had each believed they were the exception. The plaza remained standing, its marble still polished, its chandeliers still glowing, while fortunes were erased quietly behind closed doors. What these repeated collapses revealed was not incompetence, but a systemic misunderstanding. The plaza was never immune to economic gravity. Its prestige amplified risk rather than neutralizing it. Each owner inherited not just a building, but a narrative that encouraged excess. The hotel's symbolism distorted judgment, convincing some of the world's wealthiest individuals that visibility equaled security, that legacy equaled liquidity, and that history itself could serve as collateral. As the plaza entered the second decade of the 21st century, it continued to operate, host guests, and sell residences, but it did so under a shadow shaped by decades of financial strain. The building had outlived its owners, outlasted their strategies, and exposed the fragile intersection between ego and capital. The true cost of the plaza gamble was not measured solely in bankruptcies or defaults, but in the repeated realization that even the most iconic assets cannot escape the discipline of economics, no matter how beautifully they are dressed. By the time the Plaza Hotel entered its most recent cycle of ownership, the myth surrounding it had become both its greatest asset and its most corrosive weakness. The building no longer needed to prove its cultural importance, that had been settled generations earlier. What it needed, increasingly desperately, was a financial structure that acknowledged reality rather than legend. Yet reality was precisely what successive owners struggled to confront. Each believed the plaza's failures had been circumstantial, tied to bad timing or external crises, rather than to a fundamental mismatch between symbolism and sustainable economics. The condominium conversion that followed the 2005 acquisition fundamentally altered the plaza's internal identity. Where once the hotel functioned as a single organism, with rooms feeding into restaurants, ballrooms, and public spaces, it was now divided between private residences and a reduced hotel footprint. This division created an architectural paradox. The very features that made the plaza valuable as a symbol, its historic interiors, landmark restrictions, and ceremonial layout, made it inflexible as a modern mixed-use property. Renovations were costly, slow, and constrained by preservation requirements that limited efficiency but preserved appearance. Every design choice became a negotiation between history and revenue. The residences themselves sold unevenly. A small number of ultra-wealthy buyers acquired units not for regular use, but for status, often leaving them vacant for most of the year. These apartments functioned less as homes and more as financial placeholders, assets parked in a globally recognized name. Yet vacancy did not reduce costs. Staff remained necessary. Systems required maintenance. Taxes accrued regardless of occupancy. The plaza generated admiration even as it hemorrhaged liquidity. Behind the scenes, lenders grew cautious. The financial crisis of 2008 had reshaped global lending standards, and banks no longer accepted prestige as sufficient reassurance. Appraisals became more conservative. Debt covenants tightened. The plaza, once treated as an untouchable blue-chip asset, began to resemble something more precarious, a property whose valuation was disproportionately dependent on narrative rather than cash flow. When Sahara India Parawar assumed control through its lending position, the ownership shift was less a rescue than a holding pattern, an attempt to preserve value long enough for market conditions to improve. Those improvements never arrived in the form expected. The global elite, once eager to acquire symbolic real estate, increasingly favored flexibility over permanence. Wealth became more mobile, less tied to specific addresses. Luxury shifted from ownership to experience. Hotels that thrived were those that adapted quickly, scaled efficiently, and monetized. Novelty. The plaza, bound by its own legacy, could not easily reinvent itself without eroding the very image that justified its value. What emerged over time was a quiet reckoning. The plaza had become a lesson embedded in stone, that certain assets carry obligations invisible at the moment of acquisition. Each billionaire who took control inherited not just a building, but a century of expectations. They inherited the belief that owning the plaza conferred legitimacy, that it placed them within a lineage of power stretching back to the Gilded Age. Yet legitimacy proved expensive to maintain, and lineage offered no exemption from debt service, market shifts, or changing consumer behavior. The losses associated with the plaza were rarely concentrated in a single collapse. Instead, they accumulated gradually, dispersed across banks, investors, and holding companies. This diffusion obscured the true scale of the cost. No single bankruptcy captured the full magnitude of what was lost. Over decades, multiple fortunes were diminished, not through reckless speculation alone, but through a collective inability to let go of an idea that had outlived its economic usefulness. The plaza did not destroy wealth in dramatic explosions. It eroded it quietly, transaction by transaction. By the late 2010s, the hotel continued to operate, host weddings, and welcome tourists who posed beneath its awnings unaware of the financial history embedded in its walls. To the public, the plaza remained timeless. To those who had studied its balance sheets, it represented something more sobering, a case study in how prestige can distort judgment, encouraging even the most sophisticated investors to mistake visibility for viability. The building itself, however, was indifferent to these realizations. Its marble corridors echoed as they always had. Its facade continued to frame the southern edge of Central Park with ceremonial symmetry. The plaza endured not because it was profitable, but because it was culturally indispensable. And therein lay the final irony. The hotel survived precisely because it was too important to abandon, even as that importance repeatedly undermined the financial logic of owning it. As the 21st century advanced, the plaza stood as a monument not just to wealth, but to the limits of wealth. It revealed how deeply human emotion, pride, ambition, fear of irrelevance, can infiltrate financial decision-making. The billionaires who lost fortunes on the plaza were not naive. They were, in many cases, extraordinarily skilled operators. What they underestimated was the cost of maintaining a symbol in a world that no longer needed symbols to function. By the time the Plaza Hotel crossed into its second century, it had become something rare in modern capitalism, an asset that survived not because it performed well, but because it could not be allowed to disappear. This distinction mattered. In earlier eras, buildings lived or died by their utility. They adapted, were demolished, or faded into irrelevance as cities evolved. The plaza escaped that fate not through efficiency or innovation, but through narrative gravity. 2. Many reputations, too many memories, and too much cultural meaning had accumulated around it for failure to look ordinary. As a result, every attempt to fix the plaza financially became constrained by the same paradox: Any change dramatic enough to restore profitability risked destroying the very myth that sustained its value. This paradox haunted the hotel's operational reality. Luxury hospitality had shifted toward personalization, technological integration, and fluid space usage. New five-star hotels were designed with modular rooms, energy efficiency, and revenue-optimized layouts. The Plaza, by contrast, was frozen in ceremonial symmetry. Its corridors were wide because they had been designed to be seen. Its public spaces were oversized because they were meant to impress. These features delighted guests but punished balance sheets. Heating, staffing, restoration, and compliance costs rose steadily, while the hotel's ability to scale revenue remained limited by landmark status and architectural rigidity. Ownership structures increasingly reflected this impasse. Rather than a single visionary owner, the Plaza became governed by layered interests. Lenders, minority stakeholders, residential boards, hotel operators, and preservation authorities. Each entity sought to protect its own exposure, but none could impose a unified strategy. Decisions slowed. Risk tolerance narrowed. The Plaza did not collapse under bad leadership, it stagnated under collective caution. Every move was incremental, reactive, and designed to buy time rather than solve the underlying contradiction. Meanwhile, the broader world of wealth continued to evolve away from the Plaza's core assumptions. The very individuals who once competed to own permanent symbols of status now prioritized liquidity, discretion, and optionality. Tech fortunes, sovereign wealth funds, and mobile capital favored assets that could be exited quickly or scaled globally. The Plaza offered none of these advantages. It was heavy, immobile, and emotionally charged. Selling it outright risked public scrutiny. Altering it risked backlash. Holding it promised prestige but delivered persistent exposure. The cumulative effect of these pressures was subtle but profound. The Plaza ceased to function as a vehicle for growth and instead became a vessel for preservation, not of capital, but of identity. Owners were no longer betting that it would make them richer. They were betting that it would not make them poorer, at least not too quickly. This defensive posture marked the final transformation of the Plaza gamble. What began as a bold assertion of confidence had become a slow negotiation with inevitability. And yet, the building endured. Tourists continued to arrive. Weddings continued to be booked. Films continued to frame the Plaza as shorthand for elegance and permanence. The public story remained intact even as the private arithmetic told a more sobering tale. The Plaza had succeeded at the one task it had always performed flawlessly, projecting stability. It just no longer mattered whether that stability was real. In this sense, the Plaza did not merely cost billionaires their fortunes, it revealed the emotional architecture of modern wealth. It showed how symbols can outlive systems, how reputation can resist correction, and how the desire to belong to history can override even the clearest financial warnings. The Plaza was never a failed building. It was a successful illusion, and illusions, once institutionalized, are extraordinarily expensive to maintain. As night falls on Fifth Avenue and the hotel's facade glows under artificial light, the Plaza appears unchanged, almost eternal. But eternity, as its owners learned repeatedly, does not balance a ledger. The true cost of the Plaza gamble was not just monetary. It was the slow realization that in an age of speed and abstraction, permanence itself can become a liability. In the end, the Plaza Hotel did not collapse in flames, nor did it close its doors in disgrace. There was no single moment that could be pointed to as the definitive failure. Instead, its story resolved the way many great financial myths do, quietly, gradually, and without ceremony. The losses were real, but they were absorbed slowly, diffused across decades, institutions, and balance sheets until no single individual could be said to have paid the full price. This diffusion is precisely what allowed the Plaza to endure. It was too large, too symbolic, and too culturally embedded to be allowed a clean ending. By the early 2020s, the Plaza had settled into a form of suspended relevance. It remained profitable enough to operate, prestigious enough to attract guests, and famous enough to justify continued preservation. But it no longer functioned as a vehicle for transformational wealth. No new billionaire emerged richer for having owned it. The era in which the plaza could meaningfully amplify a fortune had passed. What it offered instead was maintenance, of image, of legacy, of association with a version of elite society that no longer fully existed. This outcome revealed something deeply instructive about modern capital. Wealth today is increasingly abstract, algorithmic, and mobile. It flows through data centers, platforms, derivatives, and intellectual property rather than through stone, marble, and location. The plaza belonged to an earlier logic, one in which permanent signal dominance and architecture served as proof of arrival. That logic collapsed not because it was foolish, but because the world that sustained it moved on. The plaza did not fail to adapt out of ignorance. It failed because adaptation itself would have required surrendering the very qualities that made it valuable. For the billionaires who gambled on the plaza, the losses were rarely career-ending. Some recovered elsewhere. Others restructured, retreated, or faded quietly from prominence. What they lost was not merely money, but certainty. The plaza stripped away the comforting illusion that some assets sit above risk, that certain names carry immunity, and that history can function as collateral. It demonstrated, repeatedly and without exception, that symbolic power amplifies both upside and downside, and that when conditions change, amplification becomes exposure. The hotel's survival, paradoxically, is what makes its story so unsettling. A collapsed building would have provided closure. A demolished landmark would have allowed the market to declare the experiment finished. The plaza offered no such resolution. It stands intact, elegant, and operational, silently bearing witness to the fortunes that passed through it and were diminished in the process. Its continued existence tempts new observers to believe the myth all over again, to mistake endurance for success. This is the plaza's final lesson. In modern capitalism, survival is not the same as victory. Persistence does not equal profitability. And symbols, no matter how powerful, obey the same economic laws as everything else, they simply take longer to show it. The Plaza Hotel remains what it has always been, a palace at the edge of an era, beautiful, imposing, and quietly honest about the cost of believing that some things are too important to fail.